as well. I'm really excited to be here with you. We're going to have 3 presentations this morning, and I'll introduce each of our presenters in turn. After the presentations, we'll have a Q&A discussion. So I just want to encourage everybody, if you have questions to pose as we go through the presentations, please feel free to put those in the chat at any time throughout the conversation. For the most part, we'll save the question and answer until after the 3 presentations, but please feel free to post them at any time, and we'll be happy to pose those at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. First, we're going to hear from Sarah Chudley. Sarah is passionate about the accessible distribution and impactful application of academic research. She gained a deep appreciation for interdisciplinary research during her liberal arts degree at Quest University in Canada, where she specialized in political decision-making. Her graduate research at the London School of Economics and Political Science examined the impact of national values on motivations to privately sponsor refugees. She comes from 2 generations impact as the City Lab as a senior.
Thank you, Nathan. That was perfect. I'm very excited to be here. As Nathan mentioned, sponsorship has always been a part of my family's life from the perspective of a sponsor. And it wasn't until I went to school in the UK that I realized sponsorship was far less common worldwide than I had previously imagined, and decided to make this the focus of my graduate research. Previously, I had studied the intersections of Canadian identity and immigration policy, and this led me to wonder how powerful the influence of Canadian identity is in the decision to sponsor, and if this was a potential source of hurdles to future policy transfer, given that the Canadian system is often used as a model. Culture does remain underexamined in policy transfer literature on sponsorship, but of course it's necessary to understand in order to establish culturally appropriate and effective sponsorship programs elsewhere in the world. So for my dissertation, I interviewed 12 sponsors based in Toronto to expand on sponsorship motivation literature and to investigate the relationship between motivation and Canadian identity. And I did complete this project, so I'll largely be sharing what I found. Among my admittedly very small sample, I identified 4 major motivations to sponsor. Some of these are repetitive of previous literature. So the first was international awareness, and this was defined as an experience that acted as a catalyst for sponsors to better empathize with displaced persons. And these ranged from one-time vacations to countries impacted by the refugee crisis, to long-term employment, often with newcomer groups, to personal experiences as a refugee or migrant. And these experiences of international awareness were always at the forefront in these personal narratives on sponsorship motivation. It was always the first thing a participant would say when asked sort of the big question of why they did this. And each of them were quite reminiscent of social contact theory and intergroup contact theory, suggesting previous contact with groups such as newcomers might be a meaningful part of sponsorship motivation. The second major theme was second order motivations, previously defined, so existing institutional structures and relationships. And these motivated sponsors by increasing the ease of access to help and somewhat facilitating a desire to work collectively. A third motivation was personal fulfillment, though this was only seen after initial sponsorships, it was never anticipated. And lastly, a motivating factor that's been discussed by many authors was cosmopolitanism. So a sense of moral obligation or commitment to strangers, regardless of characteristics like race, religion, nationality, etc. I also found 2 very minor motivations, religion and faith-based desires to help, and very interestingly, the desire to share a birthright privilege, though neither were core motivations for anyone. Among these motivations, expressions of Canadian values, particularly multiculturalism, were very present in each, more so in experiences of international awareness and, of course, cosmopolitanism. However, it was the overarching perception of immigration in Canada that really stood out in these interviews. Every sponsor, as most Canadians do, saw immigration as a great opportunity for the country. And while their personal experiences highlighted the cultural benefits and growth that they gained from sponsorship, when they discussed the country as a whole, the economic contribution of immigration always came before cultural. And I mentioned this so as not to ignore the importance of economic and population building factors that shape Canadian perspectives on immigration. But that said, sponsors did conceive of sponsorship as an act of Canadian identity. And this went both ways. So they thought it was the Canadian thing to do, quote unquote, referring to values like generosity and openness and multiculturalism, so that participating in sponsorship was an expression of their Canadian identity. And they also expressed that the existence of the program in Canada proved that these are Canadian values. So it was almost a cycle of identity and action. So just to quickly wrap up before I go over time, national values and perspectives on immigration were heavily present in these sponsor motivations. And based on this, one of the most fruitful pathways moving forward, looking particularly at policy transfer to other countries, could be targeting institutions like neighborhood groups and religious organizations as they exist beyond national identity, as well as targeting groups with high exposure to newcomers, as this was an integral part of sponsor motivation. And I think that leads in nicely to Karina and Stephanie's presentation coming up next.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was both a very interesting and very timely presentation. I'm very impressed with your time management on that. And I think it does link nicely to both of our other presentations. We're next going to hear from Stephanie Morris and Karina Juma. Stephanie began her research on Canada's private sponsorship during her master's in international affairs from 2017 to 2019. During her master's work, she also worked for Canada's Immigration Department and learned that she preferred working for people over focusing on policy. She's now back in school and in her second year of her Juris Doctor degree at the University of Ottawa. She works for the Refugee Hub's research team and at Community Legal Services in Ottawa, assisting on immigration and refugee applications. Her research interests include refugee family reunification and the changing demographics of sponsorship in Canada. She's joined by Karina Juma. Karina is a Juris Doctor candidate and an MA student in international affairs at the University of Ottawa and Carleton University jointly, specializing in health, displacement, and humanitarian policy. She has a Bachelor of Social Sciences in History and Political Science from the University of Ottawa, and her research interests include forced migration, resettlement, and human rights in the context of refugee law and policy. Over to you, Karina and Stephanie, for your presentation.
Thank you, Nathan, for that intro. And we're really happy to be here today and to see there's a few people in the audience who we've cited in our book, and that's really exciting to see because you've all done excellent work. All right, so Karina and I, along with our colleagues, Dr. Meredith Toretta and Dr. Patty Temer-Leonard, are the authors of a book that's due to be released this spring, or in the spring of next year. And in our book, we look at the work that volunteers do to support refugee settlement in Canada. We do this through a case study of a community group that is located at a Catholic parish in downtown Ottawa called St. Joe's Parish. The parishioners at St. Joe's established a committee in 1990 called the Refugee Outreach Committee, or as they call themselves, the ROC. That was over 30 years ago now, and the ROC is still really active today. The ROC participated in many areas of refugee advocacy, but today we're going to focus on their work in private sponsorship. Since 1990, the ROC has directly sponsored they've sponsored 7 families and 3 individuals, and they've also co-sponsored more than 15 other families by holding funds in trust for other community groups and by assisting them with their applications. So we chose to study the ROC because we wanted to understand what keeps sponsors motivated in the long run. How do they maintain their commitment despite the personal and the political struggles that they face? And our methods included archival research, and we also interviewed ROC members and community members who worked closely with them to talk about the past and how the ROC has made it to today.
So today we want to highlight 3 factors that contributed to longevity for the ROC. First, the ROC was founded, led, and held together by individuals with a deep commitment to refugee rights and advocacy. The ROC has had over 125 members over the course of its 30 years. However, a group of about 10 volunteers helped to pass on experience and knowledge about sponsorship to newer members. Second, the ROC's continued participation in sponsorship can be partially credited to its institutional support. By that we mean its affiliation with St. Joseph's Parish and the parish faith community, which allowed it to more easily mobilize to recruit new members and to gather donations of clothing, furniture, and money. And third, the ROC participated in sponsorship repeatedly, in part because they were able to select whom to sponsor. Members of the community would approach them for help in sponsoring a family member, and the ROC would often agree to do so. So there's something important to be said about the ability to select who to sponsor.
So we think it's important to understand why groups like the ROC do what they do over decades, because the government is increasingly relying on private sponsors to resettle refugees in Canada. Canada's current government, the Liberal government, has promised to resettle 22,500 refugees this year through private sponsorship. Comparatively, it's only promised to resettle about half that amount through government sponsorship. And in the most recent election, the Conservative Party, the opposition, pledged to eliminate government sponsorship if elected and to rely almost exclusively on private sponsorship and joint sponsorship. The issue here, as we see it, is that there are shifts in Canada's demographics that may make it difficult to recruit more and more sponsors. Data indicates that religiosity in Canada is decreasing, and also that Canada's volunteers are aging. But private sponsors have traditionally been led by faith-affiliated groups and organizations. As of 2014, an estimated 72% of sponsorship agreement holders, meaning the groups that form agreements with the government to facilitate sponsorship, 72% of those groups have been faith-affiliated. Private sponsors interviewed spoke about an aging or a graying of their volunteer population. So considering these demographic trends, how does the government expect to recruit enough private sponsors if they continue to privatize resettlement? And we suggest that the government needs to support the diversification of volunteers and sponsorship.
We see that diversification is already taking place organically at the grassroots level, as can be seen from the increasing number of LGBTQ sponsorship groups, as well as ethnic-based community groups like those for Syrian, Yazidi, and most recently, Afghan refugees. Through our research, we have found that accessibility to private sponsorship needs to be improved to attract new sponsors and to ensure that their experience is a positive one. In other words, the product of private sponsorship has to be marketed and developed in such a way that it appeals to a greater number of potential sponsors. Groups like the ROC offer invaluable lessons about private sponsorship, but it shouldn't be taken for granted that these groups will always be part of the sponsorship landscape going forward. And we look forward to continuing this discussion with you all today.
Thanks so much, Stephanie and Karina. That was wonderful. I see that at least one of your co-authors is with us here today. So a quick hello to Professor Patty Lennard, who has contributed to this research as well. I think it's wonderful research, and we're delighted to have you with us. We're next going to hear from Emily Longton. Emily's a master's student in clinical lifespan psychology at the University of Victoria. She's a member of the Branch Research Project, Building Relationships to Advance Newcomer and Community Health, which is directed by Dr. Catherine Costigan, and strives to improve and understand newcomer families' abilities to adapt following resettlement to Canada. She's currently researching the strengths and areas for improvement within the Canadian private sponsorship program. She hopes that this work will aid in fostering reciprocal community in Victoria and beyond. Emily's also involved with an ongoing research collaboration called the Refugee Belonging Project between her lab and a local settlement agency in Victoria to better understand how receiving communities can best support newcomers in their resettlement journeys. So over to you, Emily, for your presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Nathan. Yeah, so thank you. I will get started. So my project, kind of as I alluded to in my bio there, is part of this larger project between my lab and a settlement agency here in Victoria, who really just identified a need to better understand the relationships between private sponsors and refugees in our community. And a big area of this interest is this kind of social cohesive communities and how we can really foster these communities that are inclusive to refugees. And so just a bit of context, and Karina and Stephanie covered this a bit, but out of the various streams refugees can enter through Canada, since 2013, the largest program has been this private sponsorship. And the government plans to continually grow and expand this program. And private sponsorship has been in operation in Canada since the 1970s, but there's still much to be learned about this program, and it's definitely an interest of mine because we're now seeing this program really being adapted in other countries around the world. But there is still some improvements, I think, that could be made to this program. So the research I'm doing for my master's project is an online survey. So I've had 150 private sponsors complete it so far. There's quantitative measures. So these are these standardized measures looking at sponsor values that they bring in and then the attitudes they hold towards refugees. So there's some values that we presume will be facilitative, such as like social justice orientation and other attitudes such as reciprocity and ethnocultural empathy that we presume will be good in facilitating these reciprocal relationships. But there's also some values and attitudes that we presume may be harmful, such as social dominance orientation and paternalism, as well as colorblindness. So I'm concluding the data collection stage of that project within the coming weeks. So I won't speak to the results on that yet because I don't have them. But as additional to this project, I also collected some qualitative measures where I gave private sponsors kind of a couple situations that have been coming up a lot in our research, but across the literature. And these are kind of typical situations. So you kind of give them a little vignette. One of them is about a refugee family being resettled in the city, and they express their request to have a car to drive and how the sponsorship group could help them facilitate this request. And the second vignette is about having an apartment in the city and expressing some disappointment with some of the furniture and asking for help exchanging that furniture. So we purposely left these very open-ended just to kind of see how sponsors would react and kind of the issues they would bring forward, just to see how this kind of maps onto the other areas we're measuring quantitatively. And we found so far that there's really a huge range in how sponsors approach these situations. And there is on one end, like some really great reciprocity where sponsors really want to engage with refugee families to best support their needs and ask why these needs are coming about. But on the other end, there's a lot of just kind of abrupt, no, we will not be making any concessions in this way. And I think this really highlights what we've been finding is there's a broad range in how private sponsors approach the relationship with refugees. And it's very complex and there's a lot of gray area. So I think this is just a piece I'm trying to tease out in my research is, you know, what are the things that are working well in private sponsorship that we can really uplift and celebrate, but what are the areas that are potentially problematic that we can help facilitate trainings to better improve this program into the future. And yeah, I'd love any questions or comments that anyone would have later on for me.
Thanks so much, Emily. That's fascinating research that you're doing, and lovely to have it as part of our panel here today. A reminder to everyone that you can post questions in the chat. We have our presenters have been quite timely with their comments, and so we have quite a bit of time left for questions. I have switched my view to the gallery view so that I can see all of our presenters, so that you can wave at me when you want to come in on a particular question, and others may want to switch to the gallery view as well. It's sometimes can lead to a more conversational feel. Before I get to some of the questions in the chat, I wanted to start with a general question that gets at maybe some of the common ties, the common threads between these three pieces of research. It's notable that all of you looked at, to some extent, at the motivations of sponsors, and at least two of the papers look at kind of underlying attitudes and values of sponsors. So I wanted to ask, why do you think it's important to understand the motives, attitudes, and values that sponsors are bringing to sponsorship? Maybe with reference to, what prompted you to focus on these aspects, and how do you feel about that after having completed your research, in terms of why it's important to look at those things. Sarah, not to put you on the spot, I wonder if I could come to you first on this question.
Of course. I think the very obvious answer is just to better continue programs. It's better to understand why people are doing what they do, and so we can better set non-sponsors up to slowly become sponsors. I think I became interested in this just in the culture shock going from Canada to the UK, and growing up thinking that sponsorship was a very regular and typical thing to do, and being shocked that people in the UK sometimes hadn't heard of it before. But I think listening to our final presentation, it also made me remember that understanding motivations can also make existing sponsors stronger if they are going in with ideas of more paternalistic ideas of helping. That's something important to know to make it a more fruitful experience for refugees who maybe don't have as much power in this relationship. If we can get people interested in sponsorship via different routes that are not as, don't cause as much of a power dynamic, could make for healthier sponsor relationships too, I suppose.
It's interesting that this, it seems to have ties also with some of the themes that that Emily was talking about. Emily, I wonder if I could come to you next on this question of why did you find it important to focus on the motives, attitudes, and values that sponsors are bringing to that experience?
Yeah, definitely. I think Sarah really captured a lot of this. Is like, refugees come to Canada or anywhere else in the world with these heightened vulnerabilities. And I think for me, in my lab, what really prompted my research is just wanting to ensure that these relationships, their first introduction to their country and their host communities, are as positive as they can be, as welcoming, as inclusive. But they're so complex in these relationships. And I think in our research, we've really found just this wide variety of how people are approaching this process. And I think how, if we can look at the attitudes and values people are bringing and their motivations, like how can we better train sponsors? How can we allow sponsors to see potentially some of their areas? I wish there was a better word, like blind spots that we all have. But if we can be aware of those and how we can show up better in these relationships, and perhaps having pre-screenings for sponsors, or just like more training and support for sponsors to navigate these complex relationships.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Emily. And I'm going to cheat and stay with you for a moment because there's a follow-up question for you in the chat. And then I'm going to come back to Karina and Stephanie on the broader question. But the question that was asked in the chat for you, Emily, is did you explore the decision-making process of the sponsors when they were given an extraordinary request, like the request for a car, for example?
Yeah, definitely. So the kind of that first part of those vignettes was how would you resolve this issue and why would you resolve it in this way? But then the second part of our question was really, what would happen in your sponsorship group? Like, how would you coordinate to facilitate this discussion, or how would you proceed? So it really was interesting to hear the decision-making process. It sounds like there's, again, like a wide variety about how groups approach these. Some groups had kind of pre-made decision-making models about how they would address requests that were kind of outside of the allotted sponsorship budget for the year. Whereas other groups didn't. And I think those groups had a harder time coming up with situations like these that arose. Most people really spoke in depth about how their group would really just discuss all angles, vote if they needed to, or they would have a designated leader. Some groups talked about like committees, so they'd have like a transportation committee and they would be the ones responsible. Or a lot of groups said if a minority of group members disagreed with the overarching group decision, they themselves could go and take that as a personal initiative and address that. So yeah, it was really interesting to hear how people would tackle those issues as they arise.
That's a great answer. It sounds like you really thought it through prior to the session, Emily. Thanks so much for that. Karina and Stephanie, I wanted to come back to you on the broader question of why did you find it important to focus on the motives of sponsors that they're bringing to the sponsor experience? Feel free to both chime in on that if you'd like. Yeah.
Okay, so we should start off by saying that many of the ROC members have participated in the ROC for over 30 years, but some of them also participated for a few years. Some of them joined the ROC in 2015 when the Syrian initiative kind of spurred them to act. But we think it's so important to understand motivations because we're in a moment of great public awareness about private sponsorship, and there's indications that current interest in private sponsorship is very high. There was a survey released by Environics in 2021, so just a few months ago, that said that 8 out of 10 people surveyed knew about the program. So that's a huge chunk of the population if that's representative. And nearly 20% of those people surveyed indicated that they would definitely or likely see themselves participating in private sponsorship in the near future. So if you think that that's representative of the Canadian population, then that's almost 4 million Canadians that would participate in private sponsorship. And that's not currently the number of private sponsors participating or the current number that the government can facilitate. So we think it's important to understand what motivates sponsors to get involved, because there are people that are interested, but they're not currently they're not taking the next step. And perhaps there are barriers that the government hasn't addressed that prevent them from doing so. Karina, did you want to add anything?
Yes, I'll just say that in our case, because we did a case study of a religious-based group, we did find that there were varying levels of religiosity within the group itself. So some were less inspired by the Pope's message that was issued in the early 90s to help refugees, and some were more interested on that, and their whole careers focused around promoting that papal message. So I'd say that some were actually inspired by the founder of the ROC itself and her continued dedication to sponsorship and helping newcomers. So while religiosity is an important factor for groups like the ROC, that might not be their main motivation just because they're based in a religious setting. Personalities can also play such a role in inspiring. So these motivations are very complex. They often cannot be narrowed down to something specific, but just having an example to look to, like the founder of the ROC, can get people involved and inspire them to continue the work through the long term.
Thanks so much, Stephanie and Karina, for those thoughts. I guess sticking with the theme of motivations for a moment, a couple of the comments in the chat have been interesting in this regard. Your presentations with respect to motivations, I think, mainly focused on values that the sponsors want to identify themselves with, whether those are faith-oriented values or national identity or things of that nature. A couple of the comments in the chat suggested that in the UK context, for example, sponsor motivations may include a desire to dissociate oneself from particular values. So, for example, the posture or approach of a particular government towards refugees being seen as not particularly welcoming, sponsors may wish to dissociate themselves from that through the act of sponsorship as I guess in some ways a political act. I wondered if you had noticed anything of that nature in your research or have thoughts about that distinction between a motivation of seeking to identify yourself with a particular value versus wishing to dissociate yourself from a particular value. I see Emily nodding, so I might put you on the spot.
I think that's so interesting. I think a piece, perhaps like my research is in Canada, so I can't necessarily speak to the UK piece, but definitely a lot of through my research, private sponsors being quite defensive about any potential like critiques or looking at the program and seeing how they can improve. There's definitely like, that's not everyone. A lot of sponsors are really receptive to feedback and how they can improve, but I have been coming up a lot of defensiveness in critiques of the program. And me and my supervisor have talked a lot about this and how to present this research in a way that really calls in the people that we're trying to have engaged with this work. You don't want to alienate private sponsors because we need them, but also because they're doing important work, but also how to communicate what we're finding in some of these more kind of harmful attitudes and values and behaviors in a way that, yeah, really doesn't alienate your audience because we want them to be engaged with this.
Sorry, I was trying to find my my mute button. Patty, I see you raising your hand. Did you want to come in here?
I mean, if I can, since I'm here, Emily, so I'm obviously part of the Stephanie Karina dream team here, but I'm interested in I'm asking this question as a private sponsor, which is I'm quite open to the idea that my group is deserving of critique in various ways. But I will say that the government's sort of emphasis on accountability of sponsors and training of sponsors in the last 7 or 8 years has gone so overboard that it is highly demotivating. And so for the first time this year, we considered abandoning ship and starting to work instead with an organization in Ottawa that works with queer asylum seekers, because the amount of accountability and like critique and all of this is overwhelmingly burdensome. And so I'm interested, like, I mean, your sort of comments are all on the how do we bring sponsors in and have more conversations, and all I can say is that I don't want any more conversations. I'm happy to fill. I did the forms. I'm happy to fill it all in, but I feel the burden of it, and I wondered if like, how you would think about that flip side of it. That there's a real danger of alienating people by doing the kinds of things that you're proposing too much of it.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think, yeah, it's a hard thing to balance, because I've heard from some sponsors that they're really frustrated that there's not areas where they can really like open up and discuss like these really shortcomings of the program. So some pieces of that is some people really want a more like area to speak, but I definitely hear you, and like there's a lot going on and you guys are navigating a lot. And I think a huge part of this Canadian program is that sponsors are so tied to this like framework of working in, and this is what I've been hearing a lot in my work, and it's so restrictive, and people are really trying to kind of engage in the best way they can, but in most cases, yeah, are just really like married to the system that has been in place for so long. So yeah, I hear that, Patty. So I'll definitely have to reflect on that more and how we can navigate that. It's such a it's such a hard issue, but I definitely take your comment into consideration for sure.
Thanks so much, Emily. Quick check with Sarah and Stephanie and Karina, if you want to come in on this point. If not, we have a couple of other questions in the chat that we can move to. No quick waves there. So a couple of questions that are in the chat. One from Professor Phillimore, who says, in the UK, emotions are a key motivator. Anger and pushback against the feeble government policy in the space is a common motivator, but empathy too is key. So kind of, differentiating those two types of emotions. How responsive are Canadians to media cues? We find that crises in the news coverage can prompt action. Who would like to come in on this question about the role of emotions and responsiveness to media cues, including narratives of crisis that we might see in the media? I see Stephanie's hand, so we'll come to you first.
Yeah, absolutely. So we can speak just on the ROC's, what we know of the ROC's experiences, but they started in 1990, and over that time there have been different refugee crises, as would be perceived from the media. Right before 2015 in the Syrian initiative in Canada, the ROC had almost completely dwindled down to just 5 people who were keeping it together, and they were working not on private sponsorship so much, but more so on community support for government-assisted refugees in Canada. And something like the Syrian initiative was a huge factor for revitalizing the community. Canada has definitely seen this happen with private sponsors, and we're seeing it at the moment with the promises to resettle a huge number of Afghan refugees. Our concern is that media does affect the the desire to privately sponsor, but then the government has to be ready to accept the surge of interest. And at the moment, there might not be enough information for people who are on that cusp, those 20% of people who would be willing to sponsor. If they don't know where to go, if they don't if it doesn't meet their bar of facility to enter into that program, then they might just lose interest very quickly. So we think it's essential that the government recognize that there's a great deal of enthusiasm in Canada, and that these crises will arise and Canadians will respond, but there has to be the infrastructure in place to accept their willingness to participate.
That's a great point, Stephanie. Thanks so much for that intervention. Other panelists want to come in on this question about the role of emotions and/or responsiveness to media cues? If not, we have a couple of other. Oh, sorry, Sarah, I see you coming in.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to very briefly bring up the huge uptick in sponsorships in Canada after the Alan Kurdi incident, way back at the beginning of the Syrian refugee crisis. I know many of the people I spoke to became more interested, or the organizations they're a part of, their churches, their neighborhood groups responded to that in particular. But I was going to throw that in as sort of, I would say, like the biggest response to emotion.
Yeah, that's a really good example for sure. Another question that was posed in the chat relates to the role of naming as a motivator for sponsorship. One of your presentations mentioned this specifically. I know you're all researching in a Canadian context, and Gabriella has posed the question, did you find that naming was a strong motivator for sponsors and repeat sponsors? I ask because in European countries, naming is not possible and can have an impact on the ability to scale up the program. So reflections on how important a motivator that ability to name has been in the Canadian context. Anyone want to come in on that? Oh, sorry, Karina, I missed your hand at first. Please go ahead.
That's okay. Especially in the rocks context, because they were approached by people who wanted to bring their loved ones or people that they knew to Canada. It was a strong factor for them to get involved in sponsorship because they already knew the people who were approaching them, and often they wanted to help with bringing their family members over as well. So this was a really strong factor in encouraging them to continue the work that they were doing because they already had pre-existing connections. And so if they didn't have these connections, they may have been less willing to move forward because they were faced with some situations where either they could help sponsor someone of a family member of someone they already knew or a family they didn't know at all. And one of the hesitations with doing the latter was that they wouldn't have any pre-existing connections to them. Maybe it would be more difficult to help them integrate and settle. So this pre-existing relationship with potential people that they were going to help out was really, really important to them and help sustain their activities over the long term.
Thanks so much, Karina. Any other panelists want to come in on that point?
I'll just echo what Karina said. In our larger project, we interviewed private sponsors, and that was a huge motivator, as being able to name someone. We had some sponsors who were refugees in the past, and they were naming other family members. And I think really people value that piece of the story and knowing who you're supporting and details about their lives. So I think that's definitely echoed in what we found as well.
Yeah, thanks so much, Emily. I guess pivoting for a moment from the question around motivations, one of the other things that surfaced in two of the papers related to how attitudes or values can shape the interactions between sponsors and sponsored newcomers in ways that can either be affirming of autonomy and lead to reciprocity, or in some ways that can undermine autonomy or lead to less reciprocity. And it was interesting to see that highlighted in at least two of the papers. I think Sarah, your paper, and Emily, your paper, both or your presentations both touch on that to some degree. I wonder if you might just elaborate a little bit on what you found about the importance of attitudes and values in shaping, I guess, reciprocity versus a less reciprocal relationship. Emily, do you want to start first on that?
Yeah, sure. So basically, I can only really speak to what people have written in. So I don't have any like quantitative stats yet, coming soon. But I think it really just sets up how these relationships endure and how the sponsorship goes over the course of the year. And a lot of what I've read so far, the more a group is really collaborative with each other, I think that's a big piece too, but also collaborative with the refugee family. This is where these pieces of reciprocity, and that's kind of those attitudes. I think there's really likely a relationship by how group members interact with one another and how they react with the refugee families. And that's a big piece I found in my research, is kind of this group processes that are happening on the smaller level really do impact these relationships with refugees. So I think if the group is really collaborative, they'll be more open to collaborative with the refugee family to best support them and their goals and their wishes in Canada. But if the group is perhaps like less receptive to each other's ideas, this can create conflict, and these conflicts can impact that the groups don't as best support the refugee family. So it's interesting, these groups like the Rock that have been in existence in so long. I think that's really fascinating, and there's probably a lot we can learn from those.
Yeah, thanks so much, Emily. Sarah, did you want to come in on this point about what kinds of values and attitudes can shape the relationships in ways that are more or less affirming of autonomy for newcomers?
I did. I saw something really interesting. I didn't end up making it into my paper just because it was a bit too small to note, but I was quite surprised at how reflective the Canadians I interviewed were of what Canadian multiculturalism is. I almost expected them to be showboating this value, identifying it with strongly. Many of them, when it came up, discussed Canadian flaws like the treatment of Indigenous people, slavery. They were very reflective that this was almost just lip service, something that we like to say. There were some people who did sort of exhibit this lip service saying, oh, we are so multicultural. And there was a huge difference in how these two groups of people discussed their relationships with the people who they were sponsoring as well. The very small group who were, I suppose, a typical Canadian believing this idea of multiculturalism we all share, were much more paternalistic in how they discussed their relationships with the people they sponsored. And almost more, not quite objectifying, but almost objectifying of these different cultures that they were experiencing, sharing these stories without quite remembering that there was a person behind it, which I thought was a very interesting difference. Again, it was too small to make it into my paper. Only a few people were in this latter category, but I thought it was quite interesting.
Yeah, an interesting finding to maybe pick up on in a future paper, Sarah. Thank you so much for that. We only have a couple of minutes left, and so I want to pose the final question for each of you to come in on. Again, noting that you're each researching in a Canadian context, but that there's a lot of interest in community sponsorship in other countries around the globe, including in Europe. What do you think is the relevance of your research for other countries who may be thinking about or in the process of designing sponsorship programs? I'm going to come to Karina and Stephanie first because we only have 2 minutes. Quick thoughts on the relevance of your research for transfer to other countries.
I can jump in first. So the ROC is mainly composed of retirees, and at various points in their existence, there were university students who joined them, but they couldn't commit over the long term because their degrees were ending. And so there was a lot of people flowing in and out of their group. So I think it would be balancing who is part of these sponsorship groups, and if there's a way to have the energy of the youthful students and also the retirees who can commit more time working together. So bringing together different age groups instead of sponsorship focusing on one demographic and having them take on the majority of the work.
Great thoughts, Karina. Stephanie, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, to jump off Karina's comments, I think that ties in with the diversifying of sponsorship groups. I think it's important that in whatever context, Canadian or not, programs are built so that they can appeal to different demographics and not just to, in Canada, it's been faith groups that have mostly launched and strengthened the program over the years, but things are changing now and sponsorship has to change with it. In Canada, LGBTQ groups have been very successful in recent years, ethnic community groups. We talked about the Yazidi and Syrian groups. There's also student groups based in universities that do sponsorship. And so there are different models that can be adapted for different populations, and that can perhaps apply to other countries as well.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. I'm sorry to Emily and Sarah that I didn't get to you on this question. We have 3 seconds left, but perhaps
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I can't wait to hear more from participants and reading the materials from group 4. In group 3, we were brilliantly moderated by Tash Nichols from the University of Birmingham, and it was a fascinating conversation, presentations about the different actors who both work on community sponsorship or who are involved in refugee resettlement more generally, and there was a really fascinating moderated discussion about different ways in which private actors and governments should work together and maybe how they can work together more efficiently and collaboratively in preserving refugee protection, and in also meeting the particular needs that sponsored newcomers might have, as well as some really interesting discussion around the monitoring and evaluation process that sponsorship programs need, with particular focus on the Canadian model. So thank you very much for all the presenters in my group, and more generally, I'd like to take this time now to thank all the presenters who shared their research with us this morning. It's been a wonderful session. I loved going through all of the abstracts and looking at organizing people into groups. There were such a diversity of research, both in terms of the design, but also the themes, also the product of the research in terms of what kind of project it is. It's so exciting to see these research agendas building out around the world on community sponsorship. So thank you for sharing your brilliant expertise and your work with us this morning. I'd like to offer a huge thank you to our moderators, to Natasha and Nathan and Tio, for taking time out of a very busy work schedule to moderate your groups with such elegance and grace as always. I'd like to thank the Refugee Hub Coordination Team and Baldwin AV for all their work to make today possible. In particular, thanks to my team of Jessie, Sumaya, Tasha, Sezgi, Layal, and Jasmine. And lastly, I'd like to thank our funders, SHIRK and the Alex Trebek Forum for Dialogue, for supporting the entire colloquium series. They've made this possible. I want to just mention this is the last colloquium event we'll be holding for 2021. So thank you to everybody who has tuned in for all of our different workshops and symposia. You've made it such a fantastic research community to be part of this year, and we're thrilled to have put it on. We still do have 2 exciting events booked in for early 2022. We have a panel on sponsorship and public attitudes that will be coming up on January 18th, and there'll be information following online about that one. And our closing symposium for the entire colloquium will be held on the 3rd February 2022, and again, more information will follow about that. The question in the chat, yes, all of our former workshops will be up online. That's something that I'm working to finalize before the end of the year, and there will also be an outcomes document published online for each of the workshops and the symposium. So if you missed, well, obviously we all missed one of at least 3 presentations today, please don't worry, there will be an outcomes document and recordings of those published online so you can stay up to date with everything. Thank you so much to everybody. It's been a wonderful morning. Please follow @Refugee Hub on Twitter for more information about this and our other events. And I hope to see you in the new year. Take care.